Um, Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you for the invite as well, George. Yeah, as you said, I'm a kind of PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge in Tristan's lab, Tristan Beckenstein. I'm kind of writing up my PhD at the moment, so this lecture and talk is a bit of a welcome break. So I'm super happy to be here. And I'm going to be talking about our recent study on the kind of dose-dependent effects of the psychedelic DMT on the mind and the brain. So first things first, as we always have to do, we have to ask, okay, what is DMT? So broadly, kind of DMT is the psychoactive component found in ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is an Amazonian psychedelic brew that's used in kind of indigenous ceremonies for kind of centuries now. This is a really interesting book on the phenomenology of ayahuasca if you want to take a deep dive into subjective experience by a guy called Benny Shannon. It's called The Antipodes of the Mind. And Benny Shannon, I think, did ayahuasca hundreds of times in the Amazon. And he kind of charted the phenomenology of his own experience and also did some kind of phenomenological interviews with other people that had done ayahuasca many, many times and charted out these kind of principal components of the subjective experience. This is when kind of DMT can be orally acted because you mix it with an MAO inhibitor, and that allows, that prevents the body from breaking down DMT very quickly. But what you can do instead of this is you can intravenously administer DMT, or you can also smoke it in its freebase form. And when you do so, you get this very intense subjective experience. You can see here, this is a study from Chris Timmerman's seminal paper in 2019, showing the subjective intensity of intravenous DMT over time. And you can see the experience peaking at like 2 to 3 minutes compared to placebo with these negligible effects. So you have this rapid onset of like psychedelic effects at the subjective level, but then within 20 minutes, you're actually back in the room and you're kind of back in this normal waking conscious state. So not only do they create these very interesting phenomenological effects, but it's also scientifically very useful to be able to study this because DMT and these other fast-acting psychedelics create a rapid but reversible perturbation on the brain and the mind, which makes it more suitable to be able to study under kind of human neuroimaging circumstances, or also able to kind of track phenomenology a lot easier as well. So kind of diving into the phenomenology a bit deeper now, what are the subjective effects of DMT? This is a kind of radar plot of a variety of Likert scale answers after participants smoked 40 milligrams of DMT in Carlo Pallavicini's study in 2021. And I'd just like to direct your attention to the fact that after kind of, or during the kind of intensity of the trip, you have these kind of visual hallucinatory experiences related to kind of complex hallucinations and elementary visual hallucinations as well. There's also this overlap between the DMT experience and the kind of near-death experience as well. So you have this kind of transcendent paranormal quality, and also these kind of positive phenomenological effects that are associated with the mystical experience as well. So ineffable, transcendent, and kind of awe-inducing effects. And diving a bit deeper into the like qualitative kind of measures of phenomenology, Pascal Michael and colleagues have a few cool papers about the phenomenology of DMT, smoked DMT specifically, where they ran phenomenological interviews with participants after they smoked a variety of different doses. And they found these kind of overarching categories that were kind of very similar across participants. The first I've highlighted here, which is comprised the encounter with other beings. So in 94% of the reports, participants said that they felt the presence or saw a sense of these kind of sentient entities, and often these entities are trying to kind of communicate a certain amount of information between them and the user. So this is a kind of broad overarching experience that is quite unique to DMT. And the second overarching category comprised experiences of emerging into other worlds. So 100% of the reports that did this said it encompassed these superordinate themes of the scene, the contents and quality of the immersive spaces. So I want to highlight here that when you kind of smoke DMT or intravenously administer it in these kind of supra breakthrough thresholds, you enter this very different space where it's very immersive, very rich, very visual, and it's you're kind of completely detached from the external sensorium. So you're kind of almost immersed in this other world. And that's one way that kind of a lot of people have described the DMT experience, even though it's very difficult to do so, to put into words. But this is one of the other kind of participants' testimonials of it. And I'll kind of read it out to you. This is from Pascal Michael's paper in 2023. It started with softly opening up patterns, like very beautifully colored blankets. But then all of a sudden into the death bit, it would start off with orange triangles that seem to open up into, would you call it geodesic, more three-dimensional, then something beyond. And out of it would come entities out of this very fracturedness. I'd be in this completely other world. So it's this kind of multi-dimensional, like geometric and immersive state that you're kind of breaking through into this completely different plane of existence. And so again, from a kind of neuroscience of consciousness perspective, it's super interesting to be able to study the effects of this because the phenomenological quality is so radically different from normal waking consciousness, but their experience still remains intact here. And so what about the kind of neural effects of DMT and psychedelics more broadly? Well, there are a kind of range of effects that researchers have found. One effect that people have found is that this kind of increase in global functional connectivity, specifically when we're looking at fMRI data with psychedelics. So usually kind of brain regions that wouldn't be functionally connected, they wouldn't necessarily be communicating with each other. They're more likely to be connected within the kind of psychedelic state. And this kind of is related to this more global, like hyperconnected state that psychedelics can allegedly induce. There's also this like alpha power downregulation. So when you look at EEG measures and you break it down into frequency space, usually under normal waking consciousness, you would have this very significant alpha power bump, which is shown in placebo here. And this has been functionally related to the kind of inhibition of neural signals, especially when your eyes are closed. However, under psychedelics, the alpha bump radically decreases. So there's this down regulation of the kind of alpha power as a kind of signature of normal waking consciousness, which has been related to a more kind of disinhibitory neural and cognitive states. And there's also these increases in signal complexity. And what I mean by signal complexity is, for example, Lempel-Ziv has been used very heavily in the neuroscience of consciousness and also the neuroscience of psychedelics, where basically psychedelics can induce a more unpredictable and irregular complex set of brain signals and brain activity compared to placebo or normal waking consciousness. So these are the kind of three overarching neural effects that I just want to highlight as we kind of move into the neuroscience of psychedelics. But what I'm kind of specifically interested in and what my PhD is hinged on is something called neurophenomenology. And if you don't know what neurophenomenology is, it's very simple in its essence. It's basically looking at the relationship between activity in the brain and looking at how that pairs with certain subjective experience states. So rather than looking at broadly the psychedelic state of consciousness, we're looking at the contents of consciousness that psychedelics can induce and how brain activity changes in relation to this. Some previous researchers have found, this is a study from Pedro Mediano and colleagues, in looking at the relationship between certain phenomenological dimensions. So specifically looking here on the left panel on simple and complex imagery like hallucinations under LSD and relating this to Lempel-Ziv complexity. So again, the kind of unpredictability of your brain signals. And it seems that the kind of intensity of these visual hallucinatory experiences, Lempel-Ziv complexity is tracking this, so it's positively associated with these visual hallucinations induced through psychedelics. And one kind of foundational idea, like theoretical framework that runs from this is the entropic brain theory. It's very kind of simple in its foundation. And the idea is that the kind of phenomenological richness, the richness of your subjective experience, is associated with the kind of complexity or entropy of your brain, however you want to kind of parameterize it. So because you're kind of taking psychedelics and you enter this very subjectively rich state, your brain inhabits this more irregular pattern of activity. However, when you take sedatives or you fall into deep sleep and you kind of lose consciousness, then the entropy of your brain will actually decrease. So that's the kind of foundation of the entropic brain, which is a theoretical framework that a lot of psychedelic research and psychedelic studies have used. But there are a few issues within kind of psychedelic research, one of which is the kind of qualitative, the qualities that phenomenologically that psychedelics can induce. And you know that if you have ever done a psychedelic and you kind of get struck by certain insights, then at that moment it feels maybe as clear as anything could feel. But when you kind of come out of the psychedelic trip and maybe a friend asks you to explain what you experienced, you just simply can't find the words without it sounding completely cliche. And so the issue with psychedelic research here is that when we're studying subjective experiences, we need to be able to have more kind of sophisticated measures of how we kind of parameterize experience. Another kind of set of research issues with psychedelics is that within the neuroscience of consciousness, we've made quite a lot of headway over the last kind of 10, 15 years in terms of, demarcating a lot of these gross states of consciousness. So here at the top of the kind of proverbial hierarchy is conscious wakefulness. And as we travel down here, consciousness seems to fade. And so with a lack of experience, that means that we don't have to have kind of sophisticated measures of subjective experience as we're looking at the differences between these states. We're just simply looking at the kind of neural correlates of each state and comparing them. But with psychedelics as quite a phenomenologically rich state, it's not necessarily enough to just compare this to conscious wakefulness or to other kind of states of consciousness. It's actually important to be able to say, okay, what are the contents that the psychedelics can induce? And, the difference between a good trip and a bad trip is worlds away. So it wouldn't be out of the question to think that actually the neural fingerprints of these two kind of psychedelically induced contents would be very, very different. And one kind of thing that I want to highlight with these psychedelic research issues is that the way that we measure phenomenology is analogous to the way that we can take a picture with a camera. We kind of use Likert scales to capture the snapshot of experience. Harking back to what kind of Carlo Pallavicini and colleagues showed with this DMT, you get an understanding of this like snapshot of an idea of what phenomenology is. But when you take psychedelics, and actually for every experience, it's every kind of set of experiences, it's very dynamic. So having this kind of snapshot is not necessarily useful when we're trying to pair this with kind of brain imaging, because the brain is a complex dynamic system. We don't just create snapshots for the brain, but kind of phenomenologically as well, we would expect that dynamics would unfold, especially within kind of psychedelically induced states. So this leads me to kind of diving into our study, which was using neurophenomenology within a kind of dose-dependent study of DMT as a kind of radical perturbation to the brain and the mind. So again, the idea of neurophenomenology is to kind of integrate subjective experience with our neural measures to be able to see how these experiences track kind of brain measures and vice versa as well. As I mentioned, it's a kind of repeated measures, dose-dependent study. So we were looking at two different doses. One was a 20 milligram smoked free base dose, which is stub breakthrough. And the other was a 40 milligram dose, which is can allegedly create these kind of breakthrough experiences. And to be able to measure subjective experience, we use something called temporal experience tracing, which is like the foundation of my PhD and what a lot of my work has been using. And Tristan, my supervisor, has been using for 6 or 7 years now. So the idea is that we're kind of moving into more complex ways in which we can measure subjective experience. And fundamentally, temporal experience tracing is quite simple in its essence. What we would do is, after a participant would smoke a certain dose of DMT, we would present these graphs to participants on a mobile application. And on the x-axis we have here is time. So over the kind of 20 minutes in which they would feel the subjective effects. And on the y-axis is the kind of intensity of the experience on a specific dimension. So here we're indexing the extent of bliss, subjective intensity of bliss during the session. And rather than using this kind of Likert scale snapshot approach and saying, oh, it was a 7 out of 10 on the kind of on this subjective scale, we asked the participants to basically draw their subjective intensity over time. And what that creates is this creates a more dynamic measure of how a more dynamic way of measuring subjective experience, essentially. So you can see that there are kind of peaks and troughs to the experience, and we can pinpoint the kind of high and low intensities, and also integrate these dynamics into the way that we're pairing these with neural measures down the line. So going back to the analogy of this camera, rather than taking a kind of snapshot approach, we're actually creating a more dynamic, like video-based approach. And while we won't be able to kind of gain this kind of qualitative level of granularity of phenomenology, we still facilitate the kind of capturing of dynamics, which makes it easier to be able to pair with brain data down the line as well. So moving on to what we can do with temporal experience tracing further is that rather than just asking participants to rate their subjective experience on one dimension like bliss, we can actually ask participants to rate them on a variety of dimensions. So within this study, we asked them to do this on 15 distinct dimensions, which I'll go over a little bit later. And then what you can do is you can pre-process this data, and then that creates 15 time series of experience. So you can pinpoint exactly what the participant is experiencing or saying they're experiencing and when. So it's this more like multi-dimensional and dynamic approach to phenomenology. So that leads me to the experimental design of the study. Each participant, there were 19 participants involved in the study. Each participant did 2 sessions, 2 weeks apart. And each session was the same kind of approach. It would start off with the participant being kind of hooked up to EEG measures and physiological measures. And we would just take a 10-minute kind of resting state EEG scan of their brain. They would have their eyes closed, and this would be a kind of index of their brain state during their kind of normal waking conscious state. And then after that, we would ask them to do this temporal experience tracing over 10 minutes. So they would basically rate on all of these 15 dimensions retrospectively how they felt over the kind of these 10 minutes. So you have this phenomenological dynamics of normal waking consciousness and also EEG dynamics as well. And then the participants would smoke either a 20 milligram or 40 milligram dose of DMT, and they would close their eyes. They would have their brain imaged with EEG and physiological measures as well. And then after that, they would also complete these temporal experience traces. So they would rate on the 15 dimensions how their experience was over the 20 minutes. So again, we're looking at both phenomenological and neural dynamics in the psychedelic state, and also phenomenological and neural dynamics in the kind of normal conscious state. As I mentioned before, we had 19 participants that did 2 sessions each. The doses were kind of counterbalanced. So they would either be smoking a 20 or 40 milligram in one session, and then the other dose in the other session. And throughout both the normal waking conscious kind of resting state condition and the DMT condition, we would play bells that served as kind of time-based anchors every 2 minutes, or kind of so participants could basically anchor what they were feeling and when, because, you know, when you take a very high dose of DMT, you're kind of cut off from the external world, and that external sensorium kind of fades back into reality. But these bells were indicators of, you know, at what time they were feeling and when. So they could use that to index their kind of subjective peak of specific experiences, for example. So I've kind of broken down the 15 different phenomenological dimensions into kind of like personal principal components of experience. We didn't present them in this way to the participants, but this is just to kind of to basically show you what kind of subjective experiences we were measuring, but kind of breaking it down to make it a bit easier to digest. So we were looking at these like low-level hallucinatory dimensions like auditory, complex imagery, and elementary imagery. So basically about visual or auditory based hallucinations. Then more these kind of high level dimensions looking at the dissolutions of selfhood and temporality. And we were also asking participants to trace the kind of felt presence of entities over time, and salience, which was about the kind of meaning of the experience, how meaningful it felt. Then we were looking at these valence and emotion-based dimensions. So pleasantness, unpleasantness, bliss and anxiety were all kind of related to positive or negative valence. And emotional intensity. So regardless of the valence, how emotionally intense was the experience. And then we had these bodily and intensity-based dimensions. So disembodiment, which is about kind of felt ownership of the body, interoception, which was about this kind of body load, and general intensity as well. So I'll kind of dive into the phenomenological results first, and then I'll get into the neurophenomenological results afterwards. But broadly, what we wanted to kind of see, okay, is what are the subjective differences between breakthrough and sub-breakthrough DMT doses? So what we did initially was we used this kind of snapshot approach and created this statistically analyzed the kind of average differences between the TET traces, the subjective experience traces on each dimensions. And you can see in orange here, there's kind of large differences in these first 4 dimensions, which were all statistically significant. But there's actually not a very kind of nuanced difference between a high dose in orange and a low dose in blue, as only kind of visual hallucinatory dimensions and general intensity and dissolutions of the self were actually statistically different between doses. However, we kind of decided to integrate time into our analysis and use the whole kind of aspect of temporal experience tracing to be able to track phenomenology. And so I'll break this first kind of graph down into you, and then I'll show the rest of the results. But basically what we were doing is we were comparing this first data point, which was the resting state average for emotional intensity, to each time point induced through the kind of DMT condition. So this first time point was the first phenomenological data point generated after smoking the DMT. The gray bar in the background indicates that at that time point, the DMT condition was statistically different from normal waking conscious average, regardless of dose. And then this black bar was indicating that, okay, the 40 milligram dose was higher than the kind of 20 milligram dose in terms of the difference of emotional intensity. So you can see that already just looking at one dimension, there are these nuanced, like dose-dependent effects of DMT that emerge, especially when you're kind of comparing it to normal waking consciousness as well. And going into other dimensions, looking at salience as well, there seems to be kind of longer kind of and distinct dynamic of the meaning of the experience over time. So the 40 milligram dose, within the first kind of 10 minutes, participants ascribed more meaning to their experiences. And this didn't necessarily follow the kind of pharmacodynamics of the substance, but it kind of increased over time until about kind of 8 to 10 minutes. Selfhood as well, there seems to be kind of large dose-dependent differences between this. And these are the kind of rest of the dimensions which we were kind of phenomenologically looking at. So I won't go into the details of all of these individually, but I'd just like to kind of point out that, unsurprisingly, there are these more kind of intense visual hallucinations generated from the 40 milligram dose compared to the 20 milligram in the resting state. The 40 milligram dose also seems to induce these entity experiences more robustly. And the kind of come up phase of the experience was actually more unpleasant in this 40 milligram dose. And that would kind of be expected because when you come up on DMT, it's very shocking, rapid, and kind of can be kind of unexpected as well. So the kind of points I want to highlight here are, in summary about phenomenology, is that this breakthrough dose induces these kind of longer and more intense visual hallucinations and these more kind of dissolutions of time and selfhood as well. And you have these like entity encounters more kind of robustly in the 40 milligram condition. But ignoring time, there seems to be kind of little subjective difference between the doses when we're looking at the snapshot, like radar plot approach of looking at phenomenology. But then integrating these dynamics into the way that we analyze the data, there seems to be a lot more differences between these kind of breakthrough and sub-breakthrough doses. So it's highlighting the importance of kind of utilizing more complex measures of phenomenology within kind of subjective experience studies of psychedelics and potentially of kind of altered states of consciousness more broadly. But what about the brain? Um, we have kind of access to EEG data, and what we would like to know is how the kind of neural correlates of this state relate to subjective experiences. So harking back a bit before, if you're not familiar with the neuroscience of psychedelics, so these kind of broad effects of psychedelics that can be induced. Functional connectivity changes, so the way that brain regions communicate, this broadband desynchronization in EEG frequency space, particularly in the alpha band, and also this increase in signal complexity, kind of making the brain a more kind of unpredictable and irregular space. But a lot of these studies, what they've basically done is they've compared the kind of state differences between normal waking consciousness, so placebo, for example, and the psychedelic state. So they're broadly ignoring actually what kind of contents of consciousness the psychedelics can induce. And we wanted to go one step further and use that kind of neurophenomenological approach in the way that we study both the brain and the mind. So we used the EEG data and we computed a variety of neural features on that data. And we basically essentially like correlated it with all of these different dimensions of experience. So the useful thing about TET is that it's essentially just time series. So EEG data will also generate these time series of neural kind of states or data. So it's very easy to be able to associate these because it's in the kind of same quantitative space. As I said, it wasn't necessarily correlations that we were looking at. We were doing a more kind of complex mixed modeling approach. I won't dive into the nitty gritty of it, but essentially what we're doing is if we were looking at, for example, the relationship between global alpha power, so alpha power in EEG measures, and this one dimension of elementary imagery, we run all these kind of different correlations for each different subject in each panel and each different dose in red or blue. And then what we run that for kind of all 15 subjective experience dimensions. And this creates basically a matrix of the strength of association between, this would be between global alpha power and all of these different dimensions of experience. So the broad trend here, Bernie. Oh, sorry, I thought that was a question. Yes, the kind of there's an inverse association between alpha power and elementary imagery. So broadly, this group level effect, as elementary imagery increases, alpha power decreases. And the effects that we get here are kind of the strength of association because we're scaling all the metrics, so we can compare them across different neural features. And what we did with the way that we process the brain data is that rather than just looking at solely alpha power or solely Lempel-Ziv complexity or just spectral stuff, we actually did a range of different neural measures in different regions of the brain. And we kind of placed them in three broad families. So I'll kind of break down which of these families we looked at. The first were these kind of spectral measures. So when you're looking at EEG, you can kind of compute the kind of oscillations into this frequency space to see which different kind of elements of frequency contribute to the kind of whole power spectrum of the EEG signal. And what we did is we kind of parameterized the kind of power spectral density. So here, this is an example that you are looking at the exponent in red here. And anything that the original power spectral density shows above this parameterized red portion, the exponent, this in green would be the total kind of oscillatory alpha power. So this is above all the kind of background arrhythmic activity. And this in yellow is the kind of beta power. So anything above the red aperiodic exponent in terms of oscillatory activity. But crucially here in this example, there's no delta or theta oscillatory power. So that would be kind of zero within this EEG epoch. So specifically what we were looking at is we were looking at delta, theta, alpha and beta activity, and also the kind of background arrhythmic activity of the EEG spectra. We also looked at EEG connectivity, so how regions of the brain seem to kind of be functionally related to each other. So if I know what signal X is, how does that kind of reduce our uncertainty about signal Y, or how are these kind of neural time series in phase as well? So we looked at that in a kind of linear manner, looking at weighted phase lag information, and also a more kind of non-linear manner, so weighted symbolic mutual information as well. I won't dive too deep into the details. If you want to dive in, we can chat about it later, or you can read the paper. And then we looked at these kind of more entropic measures or information theory measures of kind of the complexity or entropy of the brain. So harking back to the idea that phenomenological richness is associated with the entropy of the brain, we wanted to kind of look at this, and we used Lempel-Ziv complexity, which is basically about the compressibility of the EEG signal. That's been used in a lot of neuroscience of consciousness studies, and also neuroscience of psychedelics. And also permutation entropy, which is a bit more of a complicated metric. It's basically about subdividing it into different kind of like frequency contributions, and then parameterizing the unpredictability of those specific signals, essentially. So you have a more kind of spectrally derived idea of entropy within the brain, essentially. So going now to the results, the neurophenomenological results, and broadly what we wanted to look at, okay, is which of these neural markers are most associated with DMT experiences, the subjective experience traces that we were looking at. So I'll break these three kind of families of neural markers down, and hopefully that kind of creates things, makes things a little bit more digestible for you guys. So firstly, we were looking, I'll just show the kind of results from the spectral family, and I'll present just the theta results. So these are basically, I'll start here. So F, C, P, O, T are basically different regions of the brain. They're frontal, central, parietal, occipital, temporal regions that we kind of broke up and parameterized theta on. And G is global. And you can see broadly that as theta oscillatory activity increases, this is broadly associated with most phenomenological dimensions, bar these kind of positive valence ones. And in black, this means that there is a non-significant association between, for example, occipital theta oscillations and disembodiment. So you can see that as kind of most of these dimensions increase, oscillatory activity in theta also increases as well. There's a kind of similar story for beta, but it's a little bit more patchy in terms of the kind of statistical significance that we found. However, with alpha power, it seems that it corroborates with previous research showing that actually there's this downregulation of alpha as a function of DMT administration. And this is actually tracking a lot of the dimensions of experience, which are organized in terms of the strength of association. So these elementary imagery dimension, which is indexing like geometric-based hallucinations, that's on top because it's the strongest associated across all spectral markers. And again, here, these aperiodic activity shows that I'll just present the excellent here as it's a little bit easier to understand, but basically more fast wave activity is contributing to the spectra, and that is associated with all of these kind of phenomenological dimensions, again, rather than with the inverse association for pleasantness. So two things I want to emphasize here is that alpha was like the most strongly associated neural marker associated with subjective experiences. And the way that we measured the kind of power spectral density with EEG, the way that we kind of parameterized it, we actually found no oscillatory delta activity. So when we did this in a different way in the supplementary, delta is very strongly associated with subjective experiences, but this actually might be conflated with background kind of arrhythmic activity. So DMT might not be generating these kind of delta oscillations, that might just be increasing like fast wave activity in the kind of background. Moving on to connectivity results. So I'll just kind of direct your attention to this like left side of the panel first. WPLI is basically this linear phase-based functional connectivity metric. And you can see when we're looking at the relationships between channel, like regional pairings in these kind of slow wave activity, there's an increase in functional connectivity, and that's associated with a lot of these kind of phenomenological dimensions. But for the rest of the kind of neural markers of both phase-based and non-linear-based functional connectivity, it's seen there's actually a kind of general drop in connectivity between regions as a kind of neurophenomenological marker of the DMT, the contents that DMT can induce. So it's a little kind of patchier here in terms of the kind of significant results, but it seems that generally there's a kind of drop in functional connectivity, which is actually distinct from a lot of the fMRI findings in terms of functional connectivity in psychedelics. And finally, moving to the entropic results, which I find a little bit juicier. So looking first at permutation entropy on the right-hand side of the coefficient matrix. Permutation entropy is really strongly associated with like a lot of these dimensions. Again, there's this inverse effect for positive valence dimensions. But actually, when you're looking at entropy in these slower wave frequencies, then entropy actually decreases the way that you parameterize this. But broadly, there's still this kind of strong neurophenomenological association between permutation entropy and subjective experience traces. But Lempel-Ziv complexity, actually, the majority of the statistical outputs that we got from our analyses were non-significant. So it seems that Lempel-Ziv complexity is actually not very strongly associated with subjective experiences. So this is kind of contrary to what some researchers have suggested. And finally, this is basically just a summary of all of the different neural features. I basically put all the kind of association strengths in terms of positive, so they're all comparable. So, for example, alpha is inversely associated with a lot of dimensions, and permutation is broadly positively associated, but they're both positive, so they can be compared. They're easily comparable because they're all scaled in terms of their mean and variance. But crucially here, again, reiterating that Lempel-Ziv complexity is the worst performing neurophenomenological marker. So this definitely has kind of implications for the way that we kind of study the brain in terms of psychedelics and the neuroscience of consciousness in general. So thank you for bearing with me. I'll kind of iterate the two main things that I want to emphasize. One is that it seems like alpha power is the most kind of strongly associated with subjective experiences, but actually we want to try and move away from this narrative of like alpha power being the kind of prime neural correlate of the psychedelic state, or the one kind of driving a lot of these subjective experiences. As kind of the brain is a more kind of complex and multidimensional system, and so it's important for us to just say, okay, it's not just alpha power that might be driving these changes. It may be a combination of kind of alpha downregulation, but also an increase in fast wave activity as well. Because if we were just focusing on this alpha power downregulation, it seems to not corroborate with the fact that this downregulation is also associated with unconscious states like deep sleep and anesthesia, for example. So it's a more kind of multifaceted approach that we want to kind of look at. And the Lempel-Ziv complexity findings were curious, and this kind of has implications for, the entropic brain theory. And although it still kind of might be a powerful idea, the kind of potential one-to-one mapping between this quote unquote phenomenological richness of experience and the entropy of the brain is a bit more complex. So Lempel-Ziv complexity was not only poorly associated, but actually permutation entropy in these lower frequencies decreased as a function of these kind of radical changes in subjective experience. So the kind of bridge between the mind and the brain in terms of subjective richness and entropy might not be so clear cut And finally, I just want to kind of talk about some implications for the neuroscience of altered states of consciousness. So, the way that we talk about experience is inherently like it's a multimodal, multidimensional phenomena. In this example, from this first person perspective, the sensations that you would experience would be, the touch of the keys, the sound that the piano would elicit, the sight of the books on the kind of top of the piano as well. And so when we're thinking about consciousness in this multimodal way, it's also important for us to think about consciousness in a more multidimensional way. And temporal experience tracing can actually uncover this. So it's not just, changes in visual hallucinations that are typifying the DMT experience. It's also these valence-based dimensions and dissolutions in self as well. So when we're looking at dynamics over time, we can actually do this in a more multidimensional way and hopefully kind of shrink the explanatory gap even just a kind of little bit. And again, kind of maybe singing the praises of TET a little bit too much, but I think TET is better than kind of Likert scales and more suitable for these neurophenomenological approaches because it provides a more accurate estimate of what the participant is feeling and when. So again, the ability for you to be able to bridge the gap between the mind and the brain, it gets narrower. You're kind of shrinking this gap a little bit. And finally, I want to kind of highlight how, as a community, maybe we can move away from the idea of the psychedelic states and move towards kind of psychedelic contents that are induced. Because like meditation, it's an umbrella term, psychedelics is an umbrella term, and that might be kind of pharmacologically based, but actually the contents of experience that the psychedelics can induce are very multifaceted. And so we wouldn't expect one, neural fingerprint of the state. And so we need to move to a more complex way in which we can think about what kind of states psychedelics can induce. So thank you so much for bearing with me. I'll be happy to take questions in a second. I'll just like to thank the Consciousness, Culture and Complexity Lab in Buenos Aires, specifically Enzo and Carla. I ran this study with them over in Argentina last year, or 2 years ago, actually. And it was a wonderful experience. So I'm really happy that they invited me and they were so, generous and were able to kind of make this study happen. Also to the Cambridge Consciousness and Cognition Lab, where I've been doing my PhD, and to Tristan and Andreas for being such great supervisors, and to Barbara in the middle for doing a lot of the heavy lifting with TET for her PhD. If you're interested, we also have a similar study on breath work, looking at the neurophenomenology using very similar methods. So if you're interested in that, do check out this paper and you can scan the QR code there. And I'm also looking for a job as well. So I'm writing up my PhD now. So if you know of any opportunities, please do get in touch. So thank you so much for listening.